Our next session will be our outbrief from our NSTIC pilots. As you know, a key part of our strategy has been to seed the marketplace and to work with private industry in our collaborative agreements to help bring NSTIC solutions to the market, put them in production environments, really tease out all the challenges that come into play when we actually put these in the wild, work out production systems, work out liability that's necessary, make sure the business model makes sense. So today we have 6 pilots that I'll be presenting, 4 of which will be from our initial set of pilots, and then 2 as well from our state pilots as well. So the first half of the session, each of the pilots will be coming up and presenting, talking about their progress, their lessons learned. Special thanks to both the Nova Health Systems and AARP to help represent where their relying parties are, what impacts that they have in some of their systems, and sort of what are the business drivers that made their pilots successful as well. And then at the end of the presentations, we'll be bringing all the panelists up to moderate an audience Q&A between those in the room as well as those on the phone and online. So without any further ado, our first presenter is Ken Klingenstein from Internet 2. Thanks, Ken.
Thanks, Phil. I'm going to be leaving for the airport after my presentation, so I won't be part of the panel. So I don't know if you want to have a couple of seconds of questions or not at that point, but nah? Okay. KJK at internet2.edu if you have questions. I'm out there. We had 5 or 6 work areas proposed as part of our cooperative agreement with the NPO, and this is an overview of them. The first was in multi-factor authentication. I remain really overwhelmed with the leverage between federated identity and MFA. And we need a t-shirt that shows somebody with a bandolier of 50 devices for MFA being replaced by just 1 token with federated identity. It's an awesome leverage. It's not only a leverage for the user who has a single token, it reduces costs in the system, it reduces vulnerabilities, et cetera. So I think we really need to be hammering as a community on this leverage, because I haven't seen anything else like that in the identity ecosystem. A single token and the concept of federated identity, suddenly you have an overwhelming combination. I would put that in as, when we sell MFA to our community, we sell it not just as it will help you locally, but it's what you as a citizen of our federation should be doing for all of the relying parties out there who can benefit. Ask not what your federation can do for you, but what you can do for your federation. A single MFA device really fundamentally changes how you are in the community and what you can do for your other community members. And we're seeing this now being exploited left and right, and I'll talk about that near the end. So we did some motivating ROI and deployment strategies. We did some software adaptations for SHIB and CAS. SHIB is the world's largest open source federating software. It's used not just by all of the R&E federations around the world, but certainly the work that GTRI does with NEAF, et cetera, all of that is SHIB-based. So by putting a multi-context broker into the SHIB stack, we have hopefully benefited a number of different verticals. CAS is also a fairly widely deployed single sign-on mechanism that we've enabled now with multi-context brokers. Enterprise management tool. We haven't really done that, and I want to point that out as a gap in the environment. That when you start to do MFA, there's a lot of management that the enterprise wants to do. This application, yes. This application, no. This user in this particular location, yes. This particular user in that location, no. You don't want the doctor having to rewash his hands to do his MFA device because he's inside the hospital room. So there's a lot of management stuff around MFA that hasn't been addressed, I don't think, by the marketplace. It's really key for the enterprise going forward, especially if you want to use MFA nimbly in your environment. Citizen-centric attributes, I'll talk about in just a second. Anonymous credentials, again, I have a separate slide about the metadata, and then we'll drill down into that other stuff. Was there a comment or a question? Okay. So the MFA stuff, it's 140 universities moving into it. We did a lot of planning guides, return on investment. I think the water is safe. That said, I'm a self-inflicted wound. I'll talk about that in a minute, but my institution has deployed MFA, and suddenly I can't share that account with my wife the way I used to, you know? So, sad to say. There's the multi-context broker. It's released and it's folding into the mainstream, heavily utilized. Citizen-centric attributes. We did a number of pieces of work in that space, created a registry. I think I mentioned in one of our meetings yesterday about wouldn't it be nice if the IDESG started to coalesce some of the attribute registries or at least link them that are out there. And almost every community of interest will wind up building an attribute registry so that they can have common semantics and syntax for the things that they're exchanging as payloads. Wouldn't it be nice if some of that stuff was actually traceable? Annotated use cases, we took one of the early use cases from the IDESG process and began to annotate it. In particular, there is a gap around what identifier you use during an act of authentication. So I've authenticated at my IDP. They're about to pass on an act of authentication, maybe an LOA associated with that act of authentication, and a user associated with that act of authentication. It can either be an opaque identifier, or it can be a transparent identifier. It can be linkable or unlinkable. So a lot of attention needs to be paid to that identifier that's included in that assertion that leaves the IDP. And the use cases to date had not paid attention to it. Bless Jim Fenton's heart, he's been ruthless recently in the use case stuff in pointing out that fact, and he's spot on. So there's an important identifier there. We'll be doing some white papers that I've been working on in the last few days around attribute bundles, meta attributes, et cetera. Just to explain to you what a meta-attribute is, we saw a nasty problem where an IDP in Ireland working within a single federation was getting an attribute for name and life was okay. They went multi-federations, and other federations said, well, we use name differently, and suddenly they started asking for 25 attributes where there used to be just one for name. Because they didn't know exactly what every other federation was using for that context. Wouldn't it be nice if we had a meta-attribute name and then we can map it down? And I've been harping about the mapping issues that we're going to have to go into because we're not one culture globally. Anonymous credentials. I just had a quick conversation with John Bickham about whether or not they're ready for prime time. They're getting closer to prime time in at least one vendor's eyes. In another vendor's eyes, they're still being lobbed over the transom as raw code, and enough about that. Metadata and trust, we did some work early on in the periodic table of trust elements, and now user-readable marks, and I'll talk about privacy lens in a second. Citizen-centric attributes, we did this work. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over it except to highlight that there is an accessibility schema that is very good out there that I've talked about in the past that GPII has done, international group. It changes fundamentally the approaches to accessibility that we use as a society. The schema has been standardized by ISO. Just as a reference point, ISO charges for every schema, but this one, it's free. They recognize the public sector value of it. UMA integration, very important for offline use. And if you have an UMA-enabled IDP, we'll get some leverage out of some of the other work that we're doing. Anonymous credentials. I think most people know about it as a concept. It's fabled. It provided an elegance and a mechanism for unobservability. It's got complex IPR in the real world. Microsoft and IBM share that. it is the case, and maybe we'll have some moderation of this, but IBM and Microsoft are not identity companies. And so they look at this stuff and they go, how does it relate to our core business? And so it results in, at least in our experiences with IBM, as getting stuff thrown over the transom versus good, solid product release with version numbers and plans and other kinds of things. You know, so it goes. Lots of unresolved issues. There's a major EU effort. Kai Rattenberg has been at this meeting talking about some of their work. We finally got working code, the ability to issue a credential and deliver it to a user's desktop, and that's as far as we got, and that was after waiting for months for each release of code. Trusted metadata, I won't go into this, except that we've, I think as a community within IDESG, we've moved miles from the original monolithic trust model to a much more sophisticated understanding of the elements of trust and how we want to couple them together. All good stuff, and I think it's moving forward well. End entity tags are stuff that we're starting to exploit left and right as a scaling mechanism for characterizing the behavior of IDPs and SPs. I think that's going to be a feature of life going forward. We always have these conversations about LOA of attributes. There's Art's there as a fan of that stuff. And we love the depths of issues. And frankly, the relying parties, in most cases, just don't care. In fact, the relying parties are comfortable with self-asserted attributes. My God, you know? So it goes. Most of our work going forward now is going to be around an open source piece of software and a set of functionalities around privacy management and consent. It's called Privacy Lens, and it's doing a couple of things in this landscape. First of all, it's defining a set of functionalities that consent management should have, things like revocation of consent, things like informed consent, the ability to find out more information about that, ability to constrain the scope of the consent. There's a number of functionalities that consent managers should have. We're trying to help spec those out, and then we're building an implementation, an open source implementation that does that. Underneath that, there's a set, and that's what the internals piece is. Underneath that, there's a set of internals that are really critical for the marketplace to come. One thing that bubbled up in conversations in the last few days is portability of IDPs. I want to be able to switch my IDP, but if I've set 600 attribute release preferences with my current IDP, how do I switch to another IDP? Well, we need portability of my consent policies. And some of us have been joking about comma-separated values will come back into our world one more time, because it's always a way to move things around. But if we're going to create a marketplace for identity, portability of consent management is critical. And that's one of the things we're going to be doing here. So it's a set of capabilities for the consent manager that Privacy Lens is embodying, fine-grained control, bundling. I'll show you a screen or two in a second. It also embraces a style of presentation. So it's more than just a set of functionalities. It's affirmative actions. Should the button say continue, or should it say yes? It turns out that the research shows that people have fundamentally different mental processes around the word continue versus yes or I accept or some other phrases. And so we have to pay attention to the little things inside the button, because that really fundamentally affects people's behavior. So we're talking about clear screens and sliders, affirmative user actions. We're protocol agnostic. We have to have audit and security logs in the New World Order. This is Google's consent screen. Squint, really hard. They like white space, sometimes, except when you can put ads in there. A couple of things to note is that it's hard to read. Another thing to note is that when I ask for informed consent, I get that. Notice that there is no per attribute management. Contrast that to Privacy Lens, which has these functionalities. It's open source, it's out there. I would advise you not to use it, but I'm going to have a working demo site within hours, I hope, that I will send out the URL to everybody inside IDESG, and you can play and pound on it. That's a little bit of what our consent looks like. Notice we have sliders. Notice we have individual controls. Notice we're indicating the value that's being released, so users can correct and redress problems with the values. Notice that there's a little I there for informed. What can that link to? And notice the continue to CMU's calendar, yes, no, affirmative actions. Let's see, I guess I took out what the I links to. It has, the research has established a set of questions individuals want to know about how the information is going to be used. Informed consent is structured to address each of those questions with bold highlights for, you have a question about this, here's the answer. Informed consent can also go into other mechanisms. So we're going to be plumbing it into reputation systems. What do my friends release? Et cetera. So it's an open door into informed consent in a hierarchical fashion. Notice the bottom two lines. Privacy management is painful. You know, you take a half hour to say, oh, if I don't release these attributes, how will the application get affected? If I do release these attributes, will I get a rubber squeeze toy? So you go through all this process, and then your feeling is, good Lord, I don't want to do that again for a while. So we have the ability to suppress the screens going forward for some amount of time, for some event, when a privacy policy changes, when one of the values I'm transmitting changes. So we want triggers, we want out-of-band notification. Don't show me this screen, but send me an SMS message when my attributes get released. So again, we want to be able to equip the users with full functionality for affirmative action. Here's some of the stuff that's going on there. We are now putting UMA into this for offline use. Very important for many different use cases, including healthcare. Here's some of the internal stuff. Here's what we will be developing inside the internals. The question of where the informed consent information comes from is an interesting one. Today, we do that inside our metadata, but we're one of the fully metadata-enabled mechanisms, and so other sources can be used for supplying the informed consent information. We're now beginning to deploy this at a number of institutions, a fascinating process. What applications, what uses need consent, what uses don't need consent, how are we going to handle the revocation mechanisms? As far as we can understand, within the technologies today, consent has to be handled out of band. Because typically if you said, I don't want to see the screen for 6 months, you won't see the screen for 6 months. So how do you change your policy? We provide a website for managing consent. One last comment. I was asked to talk about RP adoption issues. We don't have RP adoption issues in our community. In fact, I just got a note from Illinois today. They had 1.9 million single sign-on logins in the space of a week, last week, going to 471 different relying parties. So for some communities, again, communities that face external as much as we face internal, we don't have an RP problem. MFA is gaining much broader traction, as I already indicated. Sometimes it sucks in terms of practices. Lessons learned, we talked about the leverage, but notice the inversion, and I've heard that come up as well. The IDP in our landscape pays the expense of MFA. All the relying parties benefit. In our community, that's okay. In other communities, it may not sell. The use of the right kind of identifiers is critical to preserving privacy. I already harped on that, and Jim Fenton's good work in that. We will be, there's an open standard, open source set of components and capabilities that we think can implement the NSTIC vision. I go back a lot to the original animation that was done 4 years ago. We have working code that will enable that animation today. I think that's progress on the part of the NSTIC community. Social DeSamo, we do a lot of social DeSamo gateway. It's big business. We don't want to give accounts out to parents. We want parents to use their social identity to come in and look at student bills. Standard use case. It turns out we have in production now a social DeSamo gateway. It's being used by numerous universities. It is fraught with issues. not unsolvable issues, but policy issues galore, largely because the attributes being conveyed by the social identity provider are self-asserted. And what do you do when you get self-asserted and being verified? Who runs that? It's also the case that the social identity providers don't describe the behavior of their identifiers. So we all heard 6 months ago, Yahoo got in the business of reassigning email addresses. Oh my God, did that take a lot of relying parties into a dither, because that's their anchor identifier. So the fact that there are these identifiers in use in the social world that are not well coordinated and documented in terms of their opacity and persistence and uniqueness is problematic. And then what we're trying to show now, and we'll have some test results hopefully within the next year, is that privacy can be managed. It's fine. Because I think there's a sense that users don't want that. We will be able to suppress privacy management, but we want to enable it if it matters. That's it.